fine driving home. But he had been wrong, as anyone who thinks that is. Before long, he had caught the attention of a police officer who was now pursuing him. Sammy knew he could not afford to get caught because, in addition to being heavily intoxicated, he didn't even possess a driver's license. And so, at that moment, he was pushing his car to nearly 100 miles an hour in an attempt to escape. But not only was the officer steadily gaining on him, Sammy could also see another problem developing ahead. There was another vehicle in front of him that was obeying the speed limit, and Sammy was on course to crash directly into it unless he swerved around it. This was not a highway where changing lanes was simple. It was a local 2-lane road. So Sammy knew that if he wanted to get around the slower vehicle, he would need to move into the lane of oncoming traffic. After a quick glance, he didn't see any approaching headlights, so he decided to take the chance and hope for the best. He jerked the wheel and began to swing around the slower moving car. But Sammy was extremely drunk, and with a police officer on his tail, his anxiety was through the roof. In that state, Sammy misjudged the timing of the maneuver and clipped the rear of the slower vehicle. The moment he made contact, there was a violent crunch of metal, and both vehicles spun wildly across the road before coming to a stop. Inside his own car, Sammy sat up and looked around, realizing that he wasn't injured. Then he looked out the window and saw the other driver, a man in his 60s, slowly climb out of his car and walk towards his bumper to examine the damage. Upon seeing this, Sammy realized that despite the terrible situation, he had been incredibly fortunate. Not only was he alive, but the man he had hit at nearly 100 miles an hour also appeared to have survived and seemed fairly unharmed. After the crash, Sammy expected severe consequences. He was charged with reckless driving as well as driving without a license. But astonishingly, his run of luck just continued. Despite the charges, he avoided jail altogether. Instead, he only had to pay a couple of fines, which meant Sammy never truly learned his lesson. So, a year later, on April 13th, 1969, Sammy once again spent his Saturday night drinking heavily. At around 3 a.m. on Sunday morning, he climbed into that same car. The same car he still wasn't licensed to drive, and once again, he sped down Seal Road, the very road where he had been arrested the previous December. And remarkably, just like before, he came up behind a slower moving car in his lane and decided to try and pass it. But this time there was no police chase. He wasn't nearly as panicked or anxious. As a result, he began moving into the opposite lane much earlier. Because he gave himself more distance, he successfully avoided clipping the vehicle in front, and for a brief moment he felt a surge of satisfaction. To Sammy, this was simply more evidence that he was an incredibly lucky person. But before he could return to his own lane, he rounded a curve in the road and was suddenly blinded by an intense burst of light. Then came a deafening crash. His car lurched violently to one side, and all he could see was a chaotic blur of motion as the vehicle spun over and over before finally stopping. For several moments, Sammy sat there in shock. Once again, he had been involved in a high-speed collision whilst driving drunk, and was trying to figure out whether he had even survived. After a short time, however, he realized he was alive. His neck hurt from being thrown around so violently, but aside from that, he appeared to be largely uninjured. Once again, he had somehow escaped serious harm. Eventually, he climbed out of the wrecked vehicle, and though he was dizzy from the crash and the alcohol, it didn't take long for him to understand exactly what had happened. Whilst trying to avoid the slower car in front of him, he had moved into the oncoming lane and collided head-on with another vehicle travelling in the opposite direction. Both cars had been completely destroyed, their front ends crushed beyond recognition. It was nothing short of miraculous that Sammy walked away from the wreck. He staggered over to the other vehicle to check on the driver and any possible passengers. But when he looked inside the wreckage, he was stunned by what he saw. Somehow, Sammy had managed to do something that seemed almost impossible. He had nearly recreated the exact same accident he had experienced a year earlier. He was driving the same car, he was travelling the same road, and it was the same day of the week. And the crash had happened for almost exactly the same reasons. Then Sammy looked at the driver of the other car that he had struck head-on and noticed one final extraordinary coincidence. The driver was the very same man whose car he had hit the year before. The man's name was Francis Pat. He was 65 years old. He didn't even live in Phoenix City, where both these incidents occurred. Yet somehow, more than a year apart, Sammy had crashed into him twice while driving drunk. But the only difference this time was that Francis did not survive. Following the tragedy, Sammy Brown Jr. was charged with driving while intoxicated and involuntary manslaughter. He was ultimately sentenced to 12 months in prison. Well, firstly, 12 months is not long enough, and secondly, that is pretty wild that you've had the exact same accident with the same person who doesn't even live in the area. They're just like passing through. It's pretty wild. This next story is called Plum Pudding. On a Sunday evening in early 1805, a 13-year-old boy named Emile Deschamps, it's French, excuse me, I don't know how to pronounce that, sat among a group of adults at the dinner table in Orléans, France. Again, it looks like Orleans, but it's got an accent over the E. Is it Orléans? I don't know. Normally, Emile would have been eating dinner with the other boys at his boarding school across the city, but that evening his aunt had surprised him by taking him out of school for a home-cooked meal. And Emile understood why she had done it. A few years earlier, his parents had sent him away to boarding school, but he never liked the city. Almost immediately after arriving, his mother passed away, and as a result, Emile struggled deeply to adjust. He felt lonely, disconnected, and isolated. His aunt was well aware of how difficult things had been for him. So although Emile appreciated being invited to dinner and knew his aunt was trying to cheer him up, there was one problem. The gathering was filled entirely with adults that he didn't know, and to him it was incredibly boring. At that moment, one of his aunt's middle-aged friends, a man named Monsieur de Fontaibu, was enthusiastically talking about his experiences in the military. Emile couldn't have cared less. None of it interested him, so he did what he often did. He tuned the conversation out and let his thoughts drift elsewhere. Emile had a vivid imagination, and whenever he felt lonely or unhappy at school, he would often disappear into his own world of thoughts and daydreams. But not long after his mind began to wander, he was suddenly brought back to reality when his aunt placed a dessert in the center of the table. The dessert immediately caught his attention. It was a steaming, cloth-wrapped cake covered in a rich brown sauce. Emile stared at it. He had never seen anything like it before and had no idea what it Emile returned to his boarding school. Not long after, he forgot all about the dinner, the pudding, the monsieur, the entire evening, and life moved on. 10 years later, during the spring of 1815, Emile was now 23 and living in Paris, roughly 80 miles from where he lived before. The moment he was old enough, he wanted to leave that town behind. And once he did, he transformed his imagination into a growing career. He had become both a poet and a playwright. His writing explored grand human experiences, love, chaos, mystery, and the strange nature of life itself. One afternoon, Emile had become so absorbed in his work that he completely lost track of time. He'd forgotten to eat. Eventually, hunger hit him all at once, and now he was wandering through the streets of Paris searching for a place to eat. Normally he was selective about where he dined, but that day he was so hungry that he didn't care. Food was all that mattered. So he picked a random cafe and went inside. The cafe was small, with only a handful of customers seated at scattered tables. Emile took an empty seat, and before long a waitress handed him a menu. As soon as he opened it, his eyes went straight to the dessert section. There he saw something that immediately caught his attention: plum pudding, the same English dessert he had eaten only once before. 10 years had passed since that dinner with his aunt and Monsieur de Fonteville. In all that time he had never eaten plum pudding again, not once. Seeing it on the menu instantly brought back the memory, and he thought, I have to have it. That dessert was amazing. So he asked the waitress for a slice. But unfortunately she shook her head and said, I'm sorry, the last serving was just given to that gentleman sitting over there. There wasn't any left. Emile was visibly disappointed. Really? He asked. That's it? There's none left? The waitress could tell how badly he wanted some, so she paused and then called out to the man sitting in the corner who had received the final slice, and she asked whether he would mind sharing it with Emile. At that moment, Emile looked past the waitress toward the man she was addressing, and the man looked up, and to Emile's astonishment, it was Monsieur de Fonteville, the very same man who had encouraged him to try plum pudding 10 years earlier. The same man from the dinner in his old city, the same man connected to the only time Emile had ever eaten plum pudding, and now somehow here he was again. The coincidence seemed impossible. They were in Paris, 80 miles away from where they were when they last met. Emile had randomly chosen a cafe he'd never visited before. He had unexpectedly found plum pudding on the menu, and somehow the man connected to his first experience with the dessert was sitting there eating the last slice. The odds felt unbelievable. Emile quickly told the waitress, wait a minute, I know him. Then he stood up, walked over and sat beside Monsieur de Fonteville. The two men were equally amazed. 10 years had passed, yet somehow they found themselves sharing plum pudding together once again. For the next 15 minutes, they caught up on their lives. They enjoyed the dessert and reminisced, and eventually they parted ways. The Monsieur returned to whatever business occupied his life, and Emile returned to his writing. 38 years later, on a winter evening in 1853, Emile found himself attending a tea party in Paris. It was around 6 o'clock in the evening. He was having a wonderful time chatting with the other guests. The hostess who had invited him was a great admirer of his work. In fact, many people admired his work these days. Now in his 60s, Emile had become widely respected. He had published numerous plays, poems, and translations. He counted many of France's and Emile said that since he was about to eat plum pudding for the third time, they should all keep an eye out for Monsieur de Fontibus, because surely he would appear again. And the guests laughed. The idea seemed absurd. Emile picked up his fork, scooped up a bite of plum pudding, and was just about to eat it when the butler entered the room. The butler announced that one additional guest would be joining the gathering. Moments later, the guest walked in, and it was none other than Monsieur de Fontibus. Emile froze, fork in hand. He looked up and saw him standing there and could hardly believe it. He hadn't seen the man in nearly 4 decades. The only other times they had crossed paths involved plum pudding, and somehow it was happening again. For a second time, the coincidence had seemed extraordinary. This third occurrence felt impossible. How could the same man appear at the exact moment Emile was about to eat plum pudding for only the third time in his life? It defied explanation. Emile stared at him in complete shock. As Monsieur de Fontibus entered, he paused and surveyed the room. Eventually his eyes met Emile's, and he looked confused. He noticed Emile. He noticed the plum pudding. He glanced around the room, then without saying a word, he turned around and walked out. Later, it was discovered that Monsieur de Fontibus had actually been invited to a different party on the same floor, and had mistakenly entered Emile's gathering by accident, and he had done so at the precise moment Emile was being served plum pudding for the third time in his life. The sequence of coincidences spanning nearly 50 years was extraordinary. 3 separate occasions, 3 servings of plum pudding, and somehow Monsieur de Fontibus appeared every time. The precision required for all those events to align felt almost impossible to comprehend. To Emile, it eventually seemed as though there had to be something more involved than simple chance. The coincidences felt too perfect, too meaningful, too unlikely. Over the years, Emile frequently retold the story to friends and fellow writers, and eventually he included it in his memoirs. Today, roughly 2 centuries after the events took place, scholars, mathematicians, scientists, and probability experts have analysed his account countless times. Yet no one has been able to provide a satisfying explanation for how such a sequence of coincidences occurred. In the end, Emile's strange plum pudding story became the foundation for the famous philosophical concept developed by Carl Jung, known as synchronicity. Synchronicity is the idea that certain coincidences may not be random at all. Instead, they may be connected through some deeper meaning or purpose, even if we are unable to understand exactly what that meaning might be. Okay, so now I'm going to be reading the stories written in first person. This one is called My Dog Got in the House. My wife says that I'm just misremembering, but I'm not so sure. So I came home from work, and as usual, I gave my dog her hugs and kisses. She always gets overly excited when I walk in. Her tail starts going crazy and everything, and then I let her out. I had to use the bathroom pretty bad, and I specifically remember letting her out first. The reason I'm so sure is that as I walked away from the door, I heard her scratching at it, wanting to come back in already. She does this sometimes when I get home. Like, she changes her mind immediately and then expects me to come back out and get her off the porch, but you know, I really had to go, so I just ignored it. So I go to the bathroom and I'm in there scrolling on my phone, not really thinking about much. I finish up, I wash my hands, and then I come out of the bathroom and the dog is laying on the bed like nothing ever happened. I literally jumped because I was not expecting her to be there at all. I went straight to the back door thinking, oh, maybe I just didn't close it all the way, but it was completely shut. And it's a sliding glass door too, so it's loud enough that I would have heard it open or close from the bathroom. To this day, I still can't figure out how so it moved around a bit, but I always knew where it was. And then yesterday, I decided to get my life together a little bit and organise all of the stuff in my bathroom. Cabinets, shelves, all of it. As I'm going through all my stuff, I come across this moisturiser. And I remember this clearly because I had a small moment of satisfaction, like thinking, okay, this is where the moisturiser goes now. This is where it lives. So I place the moisturiser in a specific spot in the bathroom, and I don't touch it again after that. So, as far as I'm concerned, there's no ambiguity. The moisturiser is in the bathroom exactly where I left it. And then the next day, I decided to organise my makeup and skincare stuff in my bedroom. So I grab a box where I keep everything, I open it up, and right on top is the moisturiser. And I just stop. Because for a second it feels like my brain is glitching and I can't process what I'm actually seeing. The moisturiser is just sat there on top of the box where it shouldn't be. So I pick it up and I'm turning it over in my hands, looking at it like there's going to be some sort of obvious explanation printed on the label or something. But it's the exact same one from the bathroom. Now I'm trying to figure out what I did wrong. Did I imagine putting it in the bathroom and then did I bring it back to my room and just forget? Because that's the only logical explanation, right? That I messed up. But something just didn't feel right, because I remember placing it very specifically in this one spot in the bathroom, and I hadn't touched it since. So I'm standing there holding this bottle of moisturiser, trying to convince myself that I just made a mistake. And then I think, okay, well, if I'm wrong, then it won't be in the bathroom anymore. So I walk. Actually, I'm kind of rushing to the bathroom to see what's going on in there, still holding the bottle of moisturiser in my hand. Then I go straight to the pot where I placed it the day before, and there it is. I now have 2 of these moisturisers. The one in the bathroom was still where I had left it. There's no version of this that makes sense because I know for a fact that I did not buy 2. I couldn't have. It took me, several months to afford just one. There's no way I would have accidentally bought a second one and not felt it in my bank account. My only explanations are either I completely fabricated a memory of placing it in the bathroom, or I've somehow ended up with 2 of something that I only ever bought once. I go over it again and again, trying to find a normal explanation, trying to catch the mistake that I'd made, but I don't know, I just can't, because no matter how I look at it, no matter how I try to rationalise it, I still have 2 bottles of that expensive moisturiser. I don't know, maybe I should just be grateful that this matrix we're living in glitched me another moisturiser. This next story is called A Stranger Who Knew Me. Last week on a Monday, I was at a local gaming spot that I go to pretty regularly. It's one of those places where you don't know anyone but you recognise faces. And there's this one guy I've seen him around a bunch of times, but we've never really talked, but he seems nice enough. So I walk in, and before I even sit down, this guy looks at me, smiles and says, "Hey, how's bouldering going?" And I just freeze right in my tracks because I have no idea what he's talking about. I've never gone bouldering, not once. I'm not even remotely athletic, and there's absolutely no version of me that someone could reasonably mistake for a person who climbs rocks for fun. So I kind of laugh, thinking maybe he's joking or confusing me with someone else, and I say, "Hey, I think you've got the wrong girl." But he doesn't laugh, instead he doubles down. He says, no, we've talked about this, at length. I remember it super clearly. And now I'm not laughing anymore because this guy isn't guessing. He seems way too confident. So I tell him again, more seriously this time, "Dude, I've never been bouldering in my life." And then he just kind of looks at me with this puzzled expression, but also a slight smile, like I'm setting up a joke, and he's waiting for the punchline, but there is no punchline. And eventually he drops it. He's polite though, and he doesn't push it any further. Instead, he just shrugs it off and says, "Oh, okay, are you afraid of heights?" And I say, "No, I'm just super clumsy. I'd probably fall and break my back or something." And that was the end of that. But we keep chatting and have a totally normal conversation. And honestly, he's a really nice guy. And I just chalk up the whole thing to him mistaking me for someone else. But even after we move on, I can't stop thinking about it, because it wasn't just a casual mix-up. He was so sure. Later that night, I'm still thinking about it, trying to figure out how he could possibly associate me with bouldering, and then it hits me. There's exactly one person that I know who actually does that, and her name is Mina. I wouldn't say we're close, we're more like a vague acquaintance. We used to talk here and there, but I haven't heard from her in about 2 years. Last thing I knew, she moved out of the city to somewhere more rural. She wanted to be closer to nature, that kind of thing. So I think maybe that's it. Maybe this guy somehow met her and then, for whatever reason, mixed us up. It's a stretch, but it's the only thing that even remotely makes sense. I make a mental note to reach out to her just to check in and see how she's doing, and then I completely forget until the next night. It's Tuesday. I'm lying in my bed, I'm about to fall asleep, when my phone lights up with an Instagram notification, and it's Mina, which is already weird because she hadn't posted anything in about a year. So I open it, and immediately my stomach drops. It's a video of her in a hospital bed. The video cuts to another clip, and she's being prepped for surgery. Another clip after that shows her holding containers filled with pills, and then in the caption of the video it becomes clear what happened. She had been bouldering, and she fell. And she didn't just get hurt, she broke her back in multiple places, and now she's a paraplegic. I can't help but stare at my phone because less than 24 hours earlier, a stranger had confidently insisted that I had been talking to him about bouldering, and I jokingly said that I'd probably fall and break my back. I'm in complete shock, and obviously I feel awful for her. So I started reaching out to mutual friends trying to figure out what happened, but nobody really knows anything. She hasn't said anything. There's no updates around this, no posts or anything else until now. And she's always been pretty private, especially since moving away, so it's easy for a lot of people to just, lose touch. So at this point I'm thinking, okay, that's it, that's the story, just a really weird, kind of unsettling coincidence. But then a week later, I go back to that gaming spot, and it's Monday again, and the same guy is there. So I walk up to him and I tell him what happened. I'm thinking that he'll find it interesting, maybe even kind of funny in like a dark coincidence type of way. So I pull out my phone and I show him Mina's post and I explain everything, and he watches the video. He immediately gets this very serious look on his face. He offers his condolences and says he's really worried for my friend. And then he pauses the video right on a frame where Mina is showing a surgical scar on her back. And without saying anything, the dude turns around and lifts up his shirt, and I cannot believe what I'm seeing, because the scar on his back is the same kind of scar that's in Mina's picture. It's the same place, the same shape, and the same kind of surgical mark. He tells me that when he was younger, he fell off a balcony and broke his back, became a paraplegic and spent years recovering, and somehow he managed to regain his ability to walk. He's got no limp, no other visible issues with him, and you would never really know. So now I'm just standing there completely speechless, because suddenly this whole thing, the bouldering conversation, the timing of it all, the joke that I made, Mina's accident, this guy's scar, it all feels connected, even though it shouldn't be. And the more I think about it, the weirder it gets, because I also have a back injury. My L4-S1 herniated disc. My dad is a spine surgeon and my mum is a rehabilitation doctor. This is literally what she treats. And I realise realised something new since thinking about this over the last day or so. When Mina told me she was moving away a couple of years ago, I remember having this weird gut feeling about it, like something was off. And now she's paralysed, and I can't shake this feeling that somehow I should have said something, like I should have warned her, even though that doesn't make any sense. We barely talked, and there's no world where anything I said would have changed her decision. And even now, I don't know if I should reach out. I don't know what I even say, because none of this is helpful. None of this changes, what happened to Mina, but it's just too strange to ignore, and I still don't know what to make of it. This next story is called Who Let the Dogs Out? We have 2 large dogs, and we live in the country. Inside, they have 2 beds with a caged-off area. The cages aren't enclosed at the top, so they can get out if they really want to, but they normally stay in the caged area as we leave them alone inside, which we had to for a while due to broken fencing outside. We fixed up the fence so that they didn't have to get caged in the house anymore. They can and would often get out of their area anyway, so it was more to contain them while we fixed up the fence. It was useful when there were puppies, but not so much anymore. Normally, when I leave the house and my boyfriend is at work, the dogs go outside. If he's not working and is home in the morning sleeping when I leave, the dogs stay inside so they don't bark at me when I drive away and wake him up. This was one of those mornings. I gave the dogs a bone each to keep them occupied while my boyfriend slept, and I left. I went to a couple of appointments and came home at around lunchtime. I asked my boyfriend if he had a good sleep in, and he said no. Not in an angry way, just in a matter-of-fact way. I was slightly annoyed at the dogs, as I assumed they must have barked whilst inside, even though I gave them bones to occupy them, but I was wrong. He told me when I left he heard them outside barking at the gate, so he left them out there because he knew they were barking at me leaving. That confused me because I know I left them inside. There's no way they would have let themselves out or shut the door behind themselves. The door opens inwards and it's a knob-style handle. They obviously don't know how to work that. I checked their beds and sure enough, the fresh bones were there. I hadn't left the dogs inside for weeks previously due to our schedules. I just hadn't needed to, so it's not like those were yesterday's bones, because we don't let them eat bones inside often. They're pretty messy. But I'd made an exception that morning to try to let my tired boyfriend sleep in after his recent crazy work schedule. He is adamant that he didn't let them out, and I believe him. I know I left them inside, or they wouldn't have had the bones in the bed. The bones would have been outside. And if they'd already been eaten, and they were rib bones, and these are big dogs, those things would have been demolished. I also know the dogs didn't follow me out accidentally. That simply cannot happen. I gave them a rib bone each, I shut the door to their barrier cage, and then skedaddled. I came home to find that they'd somehow gotten outside whilst I was driving away, and I didn't hear them barking. But the weird part is, I do have to stop about 30 metres away from the house to open the main gate onto the road, and the dogs aren't quiet when they're outside and someone's leaving. People might say I'm just misremembering, leaving them inside, but I'm certainly not. The bones would not have been inside on their beds otherwise. My boyfriend even confirmed the bones were there on the beds himself. We just can't understand how they were outside if I left them in with the bones. He didn't let them out, and neither did I, and nobody else could have. I'm just not sure what happened. This next story is called The Wrong Cereal. I just had the weirdest experience, and I can only describe it as a glitch in my own personal matrix. I'll tell you what I mean. It started in my kitchen. It was nothing unusual, just a normal morning. I went over to the pantry to grab some cereal. Now, the way our pantry is set up, we keep cereal on this deep shelf on the top. And usually there are multiple boxes, and sometimes some cereal is stacked in front of others that get pushed behind. So whatever is in front, that's usually what I grab. On this day, I opened the pantry and I immediately saw a big box of Rice Krispies right in front of me, and without any hesitation, I grabbed it. And I remember this part very clearly. As I picked it up, I was already thinking about the bowl that I was going to make. You know, usually I'll add some sort of fruit or sugar at least. Anyway, I turned away from the pantry with the cereal box in my hand, and as I did, I had this quick thought. I thought, you know what, I kind of want Life cereal instead. But nah, it was a fleeting thought, and it wasn't a strong enough pull to actually make me turn around and switch them out, so I didn't. I walked over to the counter, I set the cereal box down, grabbed a bowl, and grabbed the milk. I placed everything right next to each other and made myself a bowl. And then I remembered that I had something running on my computer, so I left the kitchen just for a minute. And this part will matter to you because if you eat Rice Krispies, you know that they get soggy fast. I do at least. So I ran to my computer room to check on the thing, and then I knew I had to be right back if I wanted the Rice Krispies crunchy. So the computer thing was still running on schedule, and I ran back to the kitchen. The second I stepped back in the kitchen though, something felt off. I looked at the counter, and I looked at the cereal box that I had brought over, and it wasn't Rice Krispies anymore. It was Life cereal. And I just stood there baffled. I thought, okay, you big dummy, you must have just grabbed Life instead of Rice Krispies. But, you know, I knew that I didn't. I remembered looking directly at the box, seeing that bright blue Rice Krispies box, holding it in my hands, walking it over to the counter, preparing the entire bowl, all of it. None of that matches what the Life cereal box looks like. It's mostly white. So I just stared at the bowl, trying to figure out what I missed. Later, when my partner came into the room, I asked them a simple question. I didn't tell them what happened, I just said, "Hey, what cereal was at the front of the pantry earlier this morning?" And without any hesitation, they said, "Life." Because I had Life cereal this morning, so I put it in front. Now, that should explain everything, but it didn't because, yes, I'll admit I could have been on autopilot. Maybe I didn't pay as much attention as I thought I was. But the problem is, I don't just think that I grabbed Rice Krispies. I remember grabbing the Rice Krispies. I remember looking at the label, the blue box, all of it, man. And I even remember deciding very briefly that I might want Life instead, but still choosing not to switch. I don't know, man. Obviously I can't explain it. Have you ever had anything like this happen to you? Please tell me I'm not alone. And those are the Glitch in the Matrix stories that I found for us today, guys. I would love to know if you've had anything Glitch in the Matrix style happen to you. I'm trying to think if I have any examples. I can't think of anything personally, but I do remember my brother having one where he'd put his lighter down where he usually puts it, and then he goes to get it and it's just completely gone, and he searches everywhere for it and can't find it. It's just like completely disappeared. It's not in his pockets, it's not on the couch, it's not in the kitchen, it's not anywhere. And then, you know, he just thought, well, I've somehow managed to lose a lighter in thin air. Gets a new one. And then a few weeks later, he's sat